Well, welcome everybody, and this is a really kind of special occasion because it's a great pleasure and honour to welcome my former colleague to the forum. I think it's a talk you've given, Beatrice. For those of you that are not familiar with Beatrice, she has had a distinguished career. She currently works at the Führungs-Akademie in Hamburg, where she kind of runs their sort of strategy program. Prior to that, she held a chair at the University of Glasgow, and prior to that, she was one of my colleagues in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Reading. And Beatrice holds degrees from the University of London and Oxford. She has also taught at universities in France and Germany. She briefly worked at NATO headquarters, and some of her publications, I won't name them all, some of her publications include the Evolution of Strategy, which was published in 2010, Reading Clausewitz, which was published in 2002, and also many works on nuclear strategy, NATO and transatlantic relations. So I think that we've got someone who's going to provide some real insight and hopefully active debate at the Mackinder Forum. And I said that it's a great pleasure, Beatrice, to welcome you to the first time to the forum. And the floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much for this kind introduction. I shall now attempt to share my screen with you. Because I think it'll make communication better if just in case audio gets lost in some way. And that is now where I'm going to move to look at my own screen. Incidentally, apropos working in NATO, just a point for Gwyn Prince. I just was at NATO headquarters yesterday. And I think, yes, I felt very, very alienated because it was just so incredibly large. I had been there before, but the old NATO headquarters somehow were slightly more human. Okay, I repeat my warning of earlier. This was supposed to be entirely about peacemaking in the Russia-Ukraine war, but I think to lead up to that, I'd like to talk about historical analogies, historical parallels. I think anybody who finds that boring should now still leave and get a coffee instead. I'd like to begin with speculating about the extent to which history can teach us anything at all, and start with the caveat that, of course, there is no linear development in history normally, in the sense that we can't say that things will always get better, things will always get worse. Things have gone up and down in history many times. And anybody who's at all familiar, particularly with the Dark Ages between the Roman Empire on the one hand and then the Renaissance and modern history on the other, is acutely aware of technological setbacks and regression into more primitive times in European history, and similar things apply to other parts of history. So there is no claim in what I'm about to say that we can somehow predict a linear development towards the future. In fact, in many respects, we are right now confronted with a return to earlier modes of interstate behavior. Nor am I claiming that one can model, not at all. There are too many variables. And in fact, sometimes technology can really change everything. I think the invention of the nuclear weapon, which will feature very importantly in what I'm going to say later, is one of those incredible changes. I'm sure that you're all familiar with this very stimulating book by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who makes the very good point that from n cases, you cannot predict the n+1 case, and therefore there is no attempt to predict from past events what the future is going to be, simply in the sense of saying, because this has happened X number of times before, it'll happen again. So none of this is going to be part of what I'm going to say. But what I'm about to say, to some extent, is based on a lecture that I actually gave in the Ministry of Defence in London on the 2nd of February 2022. And at that stage, I was being slightly more bold than I am now, because many of the thoughts that I will now share with you will have occurred to you since the 24th of February 2022. So when I talked about patterns and analogies, I think there is a case to be made for using historical examples to interrogate things that are happening now, always keeping in mind differences as well as similarities. But I do think that there are patterns that can repeat themselves. There is no way of predicting that they will, but they can repeat themselves because of the following points. They may repeat themselves because of structural similarities of the cases concerned. They may repeat themselves because there's something quite lasting about human nature, things that the ancients used to call pride, or the concern about honor and things like that. And one of them is that leaders, there is a trend, and I'm not saying, again, a pattern does not always have to apply, but it can apply. And even if it applies only in 14% of your cases, it will be a pattern, and it is worth interrogating your current situation to see whether this pattern applies. In human nature, we have often encountered the excessive self-confidence of leaders after a success. That is important to be kept in mind for what we will address at the very end, namely potential outcomes of the Ukraine war, or the Russian war against Ukraine. Then there is the conscious emulation. We know that Achilles was emulated by Alexander the Great, who ever so greatly admired him and wanted to see in himself a new Achilles. We know that Octavian wanted to emulate Alexander the Great. We know that Gustavus Adolphus, in turn, was very interested in the achievements of Octavian, of obviously Emperor Augustus, that Napoleon wanted to emulate Gustavus Adolphus, Augustus, etc. So sometimes there's this actual conscious emulation, and we know that Putin wants to see himself as a new Tsar and has attempts to emulate great cases there. And then, of course, there are shared ideologies which may lead to similar behavior, and those ideologies that still exist and have existed over a while now include nationalism and the sense of having an imperial mission with which you want to create an empire. So all these things were actually already on my mind when I talked to the MOD in early February 2022, and said to them that I felt that there were some similarities that we should keep in mind when we were looking at what was brewing in Eastern Europe at the time. And this is what I came up with. I thought, what do the following features of international relations sound familiar? That you have some powers upholding the rules-based international system versus some that are trying to overthrow it through expansionism. That there are three theaters in which this is happening: Southeastern Europe, the Middle East, and the Far East. That there are particularly two powers that are annexing or positioning themselves to annex neighboring territories in breach of frontiers that have been internationally agreed and also guaranteed by treaty. That great powers want to attempt to negotiate spheres of influence over the heads of the smaller powers that would be concerned by this, and that a number of medium powers are either hedging or just standing back or trying to be on the side of the growing powers, and to see that how they might personally profit from these growing powers and appease them by making concessions to them. And as I said, powers hedging, powers trying to be good friends with both sides in order to end up siding with the winner, whoever that's going to be. And that states increasingly underscore again their own sovereignty rather than commitments to an alliance or a greater thing, which will go so far that you might interpret them as curtailing the sovereignty of individual countries, which would be the case for the European Union's Article 42.7, which has been interpreted by most lawyers as being an unconditional guarantee, i.e. unconditional in the sense of the security of the other countries, unconditional to the point where the member states who have signed up to this don't have the right to say, on the day on which one of their other member states is attacked, that they will see and decide what they're going to do about it, but they are fully committed to use all the means available for them in the defense of that ally, of that other member state of the European Union. But instead of that, we're finding individual member states now underscoring their sovereignty again and the right to decide for themselves what to do, even though the European Union treaty text doesn't actually allow for that. But these things that these points that I've just listed actually describe also the world of the 1930s, where it was already a great improvement on the world before 1914, before the First World War, because there was the League of Nations. But at the time, you had the isolationism of that great major player, the United States. You had too few powers, only really two, permanently in the League of Nations Council, which was the equivalent of the UN Security Council. And those two were not always acting in unison. I will remind those of you who have forgotten, and I'm sure that does not include many around the table today, that Britain was still, or the RAF was still planning on war with France in the 1920s, which still never ceases to shock me. That three other powers were rogue states that turned into rogue states and were undermining that order. And then there was the sixth power, of course, that was a member state of that League of Nations Council. That was the USSR, became a member as the USSR, and that was a very tricky member there. There was no defensive alliance, so there was no NATO at the time, nothing comparable. And one of the greatest problems with the 1930s was that Britain and France, although clearly those two powers trying to uphold the international rules-based order, which included after the Briand-Kellogg Pact that you was not supposed to attack anybody else, that states had signed away the right to use aggressive war as an instrument of state power, and yet there was no real joint planning between Britain and France for a common defense or common military action of any sorts. And that there were, of course, the revisionist, the expansionist authoritarian states that formed alliances of convenience in order to keep each other's backs free so that they could go and embark on their own this particular wars of conquest, or even divide amongst themselves the hapless country of Poland. So there are analogies, I would say, between Germany of 1919 after Versailles and Russia after 1991, where both have, depending on who is in government, of course, irredentist views. The Weimar Republic of Germany didn't fight quite so hard for recovering the areas that Germany had lost in the Versailles Treaty as the subsequent Hitler regime did. And we also found that Russia in the 1990s did not make moves to try to recover the lost republics of the Soviet Union, but under the Putin regime now seems to be very interested in them in many ways. Not just totally aggressive ones, also in indirect domination, but still, this is, of course, what is worrying us. Let me go slightly more, add another set of features of the 1930s, which again should lead us to see that there are some parallels that one can see. Namely that there were pockets of sympathizers with fascism throughout the West. So it wasn't as though the dividing lines of ideologies corresponded entirely to the state frontiers, that there were pockets of communists also throughout the West, that there were groups of communists, people who were wanting to further world communism or work for the Soviet Union, and that each state had a great tendency to look out for itself. We might recall the abominable behavior of Poland in the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia after the Munich conference, where Poland also sat there and tried to get its bit, in fact, got its bit of Czechoslovakia, rather than in any way standing in solidarity at the time with Czechoslovakia. Appeasement, the appeasement of the expansionist and fascist powers, I've already mentioned that this was a feature, and you can see appeasement, something as the encapsulated in hedging, of course. So we had to pause those three countries stepping expanding their rule gradually with individual military steps. Now, the fact that that happened over a period of time, and that those major aggressive moves were made with several years between them, not so much in the case of Germany, but in the others, there was always a delay between them, led to some extent to the slow-boiled frog symptom, namely that people, as I did, and I will admit it so freely, after 2014, with the Russian expansion into Crimea and its activities in eastern Ukraine, that people thought in the 1930s, oh, Japan is trying to get Manchuria, okay, but they haven't done anything in the following years. And then, of course, Japan went into China 1937. But in between years, the people were saying, okay, that's apparently it's not as bad as we thought. Yeah. Or with the case of Italy, between 1923 and the mid 1930s, people thought apparently it's not as bad as we thought. Perhaps we can coexist peacefully with that Italy of Mussolini. In the case of Germany, again, after starting the Rhineland occupation, 1936, there was 1937, and there was a point where we all recall that Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, said he thought that one could do business with Herr Hitler, and he was quite mistaken. But the point was, it seemed for a while that diplomacy was going back to normal and relations were going back to normal. So let me turn to the possible analogies with the world before the 24th of February 2022. We didn't quite have American isolationism, but the gradual, and in this case, not totally linear, but gradual and increasing Pacific tilt of the United States was already well registered in many places. You, of course, had the UK and Brexit returning to a stronger emphasis on its sovereigntism and also to a Pacific tilt there. You had the lineup in the Security Council, which was not unlike that of the League of Nations Council, of some countries upholding the older order and then the rogue states that are trying to upset it. These rogue states, or these states that are trying to overthrow the international order, change it and make being again allies of convenience. We found that even more so since the 24th of February 2022, particularly since Western sanctions have kicked in. Very, very unlike the 1930s, we have the existence of NATO and the EU, but the jury is out on whether the increasing size of both organizations is not also to some extent weakening it, because the sense of purpose is not the same throughout all the member states, and one sees lots of marks of overstretch there that are difficult to handle. Members all under pressure, and there's a similarity again, because just as after the Wall Street crash 1929, in the early 30s and the mid 30s even, many countries in Europe were very much drawn down by the great economic hardship that they had and the financial losses that the crisis had produced. And in a similar way, we have the 2008 financial crisis, and then now the post-COVID-19 governmental debts incurred, members prioritizing their recovery and having great fights over that. I'm seeing that particularly in German politics at the moment. And then of course the great difference again, great difference, that we are now afraid of nuclear war or an escalation in that direction. But there is also a bit of a similarity in that in the interwar period, there were many people, particularly in France and the United Kingdom, and I presume also in Belgium, the Netherlands, and a few other countries, that were very concerned, very worried about a repetition of the First World War. Already that conventional First World War was something that they didn't want to see again, that they didn't want to experience again. So the fear of a world war and the fear of nuclear war, while in different scales, really, in some extent, both had an impact in the 1930s and very much so now, leading in both cases to appeasement. And I think that's no other word that would properly describe particularly the Angela Merkel government's policies towards Russia all that time, when it is absolutely clear that she had no sympathy for Putin's policies and yet did nothing to stand up to him and did everything to avoid confrontation and conflict. And a similarity again, remember we talked about the pockets of sympathizers of fascism in democratic countries in the 1930s, well, there are the ultra-conservatives in France and Germany and many other countries who have a lot of sympathy, it seems, with the conservative values of authoritarian Putin-esque Russia. So these pockets of sympathizers are also there as far as one can see. Similarity there in the values, curiously, of communist China with its sort of anti-gay, anti-whatever, and pro-family policies that and the policies of Christian authoritarian Russia, although you would have expected them to be on completely opposite ends of a value spectrum that, of course, in a circular way meets at the back. Let me remind you very briefly of things that you know very well. The situation in the Far East now, where we know that the Communist Party of China wants to make China a military equal of the US, has quarrels about island possessions, has quarrels about land borders, has expressed its intention to bring Taiwan to the fold, is ignoring the rules-based international order when it comes to the South China Sea, ignoring the Hague Tribunal, and because Taiwan is not recognized by other countries in the area, a lot of them feel that they can't do anything about it. Japan has now been the big exception there, and we have this hedging of smaller powers that I've already referred to. And just to look at the areas, the countries with which China has territorial disputes, there's so many, and one could have imagined they should all line up and solidly take a stance against China and Chinese expansionism, but they're doing no such thing. And that, in a way, is a sort of rather surprising and saddening parallel also to what was happening in the 1930s when Poland and Czechoslovakia didn't cooperate to trying to stop German expansionism. What other lessons are there of the 1930s for the present? What one could think of, if you believe in lessons at all. We clearly have these patterns of human thinking and behavior, which include this wounded national pride syndrome in cultures that really tend to still uphold pride as main big. After Versailles, the humiliation of the German people was something that, of course, was played on so massively by the National Socialists. So China comes up with this century of humiliation that it has to compensate for, Russia for its lost empire and supposedly its lost superpower, great power status. And of course, we do have Erdogan's nostalgia for the leadership that the Ottoman Empire had in the Muslim world and the domination it had there. And there are many examples of this, of course. So there are these similarities of, we collectively have lost our pride and we have to restore it, and we have to do that at the expense of others by expanding our authority in some way, either by total aggression or by other ways. A lesson that should be there from the 1930s is on a completely different level, that something that was lacking then really must be taken into consideration now, and was, of course, very, very importantly after the Second World War, and that is that the democracies and the law upholding states must stand together and are natural allies, and should consider themselves to be natural allies. Going back to this very unhelpful competition between Britain and France in the interwar period, resulting, of course, from the fact that both were still colonial powers, so saw each other as colonial competitors. But it's still, I think, a sort of cardinal sin of that period that those two democracies didn't stand together and cooperate so much more intensively than, in fact, they did. So solidarity among democracies as natural allies is extraordinarily important. And that, of course, means that you should then cooperate with all other democracies, regardless of which part of the world they're in. And from that point of view, even something like AUKUS will make sense. They should coordinate their sanctions rather than trying to protect their own industries in some way. And they should also do more to promote human rights and the rule of law among wobbly democracies, among these democracies. And I'm thinking particularly of India and its own treatment of minorities internally. And then, of course, the paternalistic authoritarian states. All the national security strategies that have been produced in the last couple of years, the American one, the British one, the French one, the German one, concede that given that democracies are sort of no longer quite ruling the world, they have to cooperate with countries that are less than democracies and less than fully in compliance with things like the covenants of international political and of human political, social, economic, and other rights. So there's this need to cooperate with paternalistic polities, think of Singapore or something like that, simply because otherwise you're not getting a quorum. The problem there is, of course, that anybody who doesn't quite uphold the values that we have and with whom we cooperate can still deviate or become so different from what we are trying to implement and bring forward, that we are, at sea in their relationship with them. Let me remind you in this context of how strongly the influence of Russia and China on countries that are paternalistic and sort of not necessarily full democracies or very wobbly has been in the context of the Russian aggression on Ukraine, where the vote in March 2022 produced an immense majority of countries coming out to condemn Russian aggression. And as the Russians began, and presumably also the Chinese, began to work on other countries and work on particularly the countries in the global south, and started to mention that either bribe them by cheap exports of oil and gas or grain, or threaten to withhold grain from them, grain exports from them, that they managed to shift the numbers there, with more changing their position even by 2023, and I think the trend is ongoing. Let me mention a couple more, or one more lesson really of the 1930s. I think on a sort of sliding scale, from countries that have reasonable demands and somehow fall into a big quarrel with a neighbor, another country, where this can be talked about and they even have a case, to adversaries with whom you really cannot do business, with whom you cannot come to a compromise, a solution in the end. The lesson of the 1930s was, of course, one that with Hitler you could not do business, and acculturation, the idea that you can bring about transformation through trade, in German Wandel durch Handel, that you can bring another side to become like you because you're trying to show them the great advantages of not only democracy but also free trade and Western capitalism, and that this will come about, it has not worked for some of the major countries, and very importantly hasn't worked for China and hasn't worked for Russia. So I think this is the bit where we should learn that while we should seek compromise in order to settle issues where both sides have a legitimate complaint or a legitimate interest, and they have the desire to come to a conclusion and try to get out of a conflictual situation, out of a war, and try to do this within an order and in a rules-based international situation, you can find compromise and you can make that the guiding instrument of making peace. With some adversaries, peace is really going to be extraordinarily difficult, or even impossible, as long as that regime is in power. Incidentally, the film gets it wrong. As we all, the historians among us know, Chamberlain was not consciously making peace, thinking that he was just buying more time for Britain to rearm. What are the lessons for the present that I should still spell out? I think we should assume that under whichever presidency is coming our way after the November elections, that the United States will continue to reduce its forces and spending on European defense, which I don't think means that the United States would ever prevent its European allies from using American NATO-assigned assets other than boots on the ground if that is at all possible and they're not needed in the Indo-Pacific area. I think one should assume that no conflict now that really involves the great powers is going to get UN Security Council authorization. I was very impressed that there was actually some agreement in the Security Council quite recently on an African issue. But other than that, I don't think one could assume United Nations Security Council cooperation in any action, obviously, against Russia or China. That the only legitimate action should continue to be based on the right of collective defense, based on the UN Charter, if one doesn't want to lose the overall struggle here for the UN-based international order. And that it is a very good idea to cooperate with anybody at all who is a democracy and is a like-minded power in this particular struggle to uphold the UN-based order. And therefore, I would think there'd be a great case to be made to widen AUKUS in the Indo-Pacific area rather than to try to sideline it and just regard it as nothing more than an agreement on the sale of submarines. Now let's home in on that really, really important difference between the 1930s and now, namely nuclear weapons, obviously. And in that context, let me remind you of that wonderful formula that Galois produced in the 1960s, which was to say that deterrence is terror multiplied with credibility. And if the credibility is 0, then the terror, however terrifying the weapon would be, is also 0 because you're not going to use it. Therefore, if nuclear weapons are totally unlikely to be used, then the product of deterrence is 0. Deterrence, therefore, requires a credible, employable posture, and ideally forces that one would credibly threaten to use. And then, of course, the political factors of solidarity, determination, etc. May I, in this context, point out my own reading of the NATO strategic concept of June 2022, and also the corresponding American nuclear posture, where much more emphasis is, and I'm very glad to say this and very glad to see this, on non-nuclear elements of deterrence, on conventional forces, cyber, and various other things. And I was very, very glad to see the abandonment of that old line that for many, many years was repeated in NATO strategies about how the adversary should be left in uncertainty as to how NATO would respond, which to my mind always raised the question, or whether the adversary might think that NATO wouldn't respond at all, because there was only sort of the nuclear option, and that this has been given up in favor of a line that I have been trying to promote since the time that I was in NATO in 1997-98, which was to say, get rid of the uncertainty and replace it with certainty. I was delighted to see that actually in the NATO strategy now of 2022, which now says the adversary should be made certain that NATO would respond in ways that are so unacceptable and so horrendous or so painful for the adversary that they wouldn't want to do that, that they wouldn't want to go there. So don't go there, because whatever we do, it's going to be so painful for you that you don't want to experience this. So certainty of response rather than uncertainty. I'm really delighted. I think this is a big turnaround in NATO thinking about deterrence. And I think that has come, I think that is a very positive step to have gone that way. Okay, a last one there, that it is absolutely important, it's absolutely unavoidable to have a proper workable defense posture, that you have to have this coordination of joint planning, joint exercises, and the preparation of logistics and infrastructure. And I keep being told that this is now all in hand and underway, but I think that it's going on very, very slowly. And I'm also pretty worried about how, for what a long period of time, We have neglected this. Again, the boiled frog thing, we were, I think, collectively in denial after 2014. We should have started planning in NATO much earlier for this big change that is now being undertaken. Remember, that was left in the 30s. And otherwise, no guarantee has, of course, any credibility at all. So just to remind you of the scenario then in the 1930s. The thing that is also of concern is, of course, this coordinated relationship between Russia and China. And many people have expressed their worries about how they might still exploit each other's company, and that China might move in Taiwan, as we're all preoccupied with what's happening with Russian forces in Ukraine. That brings me now finally to the topic as announced, which is that of what chances there are for peace. And yet one more backcast rather than a forecast, one little reminder of the past. For a whole long period of at least European history, successive cultures, civilizations, subscribed to the assumption that only such wars were just and could be fought that were subject to a certain number of conditions to be just, and they'd be all about self-defense. They'd all be about the right authority and various other things. There's only one big period, at least in European history, where international law simply accepted that if you're a sovereign power, you can do whatever you like, and that includes going to war. We've gone back to just war thinking, namely the idea that the states have foregone the right, particularly with the Briand-Kellogg Pact, and then reiterated in the UN Charter, foregone the right to use force simply as a tool of national interest, of national state interest. And the big question is whether this current order that was re-established, if you like, before the 19th century, it was traditional customary law rather than set in any charter or anything like that. But it's been set in stone really since the Briand-Kellogg Pact of 1928. It's been in the UN Charter. What is being challenged now is this novel international order that we have since Briand-Kellogg at the latest. And what is the question is whether we're going to go back to this yellow period, a period in which it is okay for individual states to further their own interests by the use of force. So remember, the current order is about the prohibition of the change of frontiers by force. It's in the UN Charter. In that point is built on the Atlantic Charter. Okay, that was drawn up, it is true, bilaterally by Roosevelt and Churchill, but the crucial thing about it is, and the crucial thing about it is that both of them stated that they had no plans for territorial aggrandizement, and that they believed that frontiers should not be changed by force. So this is a restatement of the Briand-Kellogg Pact, which, as you will recall, had been signed by dozens of states. And this Atlantic Charter was endorsed in 1942 by 26 further states. That's really important, because I don't buy, and we should all refute the argument that the current rules-based international order is simply a Western product. It is built on something that was signed voluntarily, really with the Briand-Kellogg Pact, by many countries from all over the globe, independent countries from all over the globe. And the Atlantic Charter, although bilateral in that way, built on that. And the UN Charter was built on many states then endorsing this principle of no more territorial aggrandizement and no change of frontiers without the consent of population. So I think it is totally unacceptable and totally misleading to claim that the current order in that way is simply created by the West and in its own interest. It was in fact a self-limiting principle that was adopted in the Atlantic Charter. And I don't understand why that's not made clearer and repeated over and over and over. So what are the alternatives to this order? The alternatives really are either a return to anarchy or one of a return to the great power games of the 19th century, where in the civilian way, those who can do and those who can't suffer what they must. Now that brings us to the question of what is at stake in peacemaking in Ukraine. One would be the possibility of Russia still winning all of Ukraine, as it seemed to set out to do initially on the 24th of February, because if not, why did it try to even go? Why did Russian forces try to advance on Kiev? The historical analogy there is the German occupation of Czechoslovakia, the Erledigung der Resttschechei, as Hitler called it, which did not stop Germany from going further. It does not, in the analogy would be, if Russia wins all of Ukraine, what would make you think that he would stop there? And that would also confirm that we're now back to a world order or disorder in which might is right. It would be a return to international anarchy in which the greater powers, the stronger powers, are the ones who can dominate all the rest. The second one would be for Russia just to settle for Crimea and Donbas, the occupied areas now. Again, with a historical analogy, what on earth would stop Russia from returning to the charge in a few years' time when it's got a slightly stronger position still in its now revamped economy, which resembles more and more a war economy? There you could go back to Germany occupying the Sudetenland with the Munich Agreement and saying at the time that they had no further territorial demands, when 2 months later Hitler gave the orders for the Erledigung der Resttschechei, i.e. the occupation of the rest of Czechoslovakia. The third one would be that Russia is completely expelled from Ukraine. That would be a victory for the Ukrainians. They reconquer their territory. They regain all the territory that has been taken by force. But then again, would not an aggrieved ultranationalist Russia do everything to build up its forces in order to, again, return to the charge in a few years' time? The analogy there of Germany being stripped of territory in 1919 and then gradually starting to go back to reconquer it after 1936. And the last one would be a great power settlement almost over the heads of the Ukrainians, as again now proposed by Italy. Occasionally, if you remember, this would go back to the ultimatum that was issued by Russia in the last week before Christmas in 2021. Where the Russians wanted to say, okay, if we all agree that Ukraine is going to remain neutral and not become part of the European Union, not become part of NATO, then we can live with that and we'll leave it alone. Now it would be something like a guaranteed Ukrainian neutrality. I always find that the Normandy setup bizarre, because I find it very perverse that they're going back to the idea that individual great powers should guarantee this. This is again totally 19th century thinking. They bring in France and Germany, particularly as it's just so absurd. It's an absurd projection of 19th century practices into the 20th century, when these countries, particularly Germany, are so entirely meshed in with the European Union that they really couldn't do anything like that together. They could do nothing at all they could do nothing on their own without the rest of them. The analogy there would be the Westphalian treaties, which real historians know, as opposed to political scientists who waffle on about a non-existent Westphalian system. The real Westphalian treaties were ones in which the inner workings, the inner peace, and the inner constitution of the Holy Roman Empire were guaranteed by two external powers, completely external powers, only in as far as they were great powers in their own rights, but they both had little possessions within the Holy Roman Empire, which made it very complicated, France and Sweden. So there would be this analogy of going back to a 1648 situation. There again, this is totally discredited, or rather the Russian position in this is totally discredited, because of course something similar was done with the Budapest Protocol of 1994, which was signed by Russia, the United States and the UK on the nuclear disarmament of Ukraine and Kazakhstan that agreed to give up their nuclear weapons. You know all this. So I'm afraid the analogies lead me to see no way out of this particular war that would be truly reassuring. And that is where I would very much like to hear what you have to say. And please, over to you. Thank you for your attention. And